So the victory of the United States Army over the Mexican Army, and then the treaty that followed, added more than 1 million square miles to the United States. It's even more than the Louisiana Purchase. So, but the problem for the United States of America and its history is this added a question whether slavery should be allowed to expand into this West or not. So the compromise of liberty and slavery coexisting, and what were the rules about that, underwent a significant change. And we see this already being a problem, and the book calls it a dose of arsenic. Because already now, instead of compromise of allowing slavery and liberty to coexist, now there's starting to be political arguments on either side to allow slavery to be even more large, more expansive than it has before, or to start to try to eliminate it and thus stop the compromise. And the first, you know, vision that we see that this is starting to come about is the Wilmot Proviso. And as you saw or read in your book, a Congressman, David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, proposed a resolution that would prohibit slavery from all the territory acquired from Mexico. And instead of a party support or a party resistance to this, instead we see a sectional support or resistance to this. The North, which had a majority of the population, even with the 3/5 clause by now, started to support it. But the South started to oppose it. But as I have hinted at you, the Senate and the Electoral College and the Supreme Court do not represent some sort of democratic or person for person representation of power. And so it failed in the Senate because the Senate could not pass it. Now in class we're going to go over free soil, free labor, because it's very, very important to what starts to go on. But for this video lecture we're going to skip it for now, other than say that in 1848 the opponents of slavery's expansion, who didn't want to compromise anymore, decided to organize a party, a new party called the Free Soil Party. And they're going to elect Van Buren and someone named Charles Francis Adams, who was the son of John Quincy Adams, who had been a president, as their representatives. So that's what ended up happening. Now, you'll read in your book how this has some sort of internal problems, but in the end, in 1848, just right after the U.S.-Mexican War, the presidential victory will go to a Whig who is, interestingly, a Louisiana planter, which is the opposite of what you might think. And the important thing for this class is that the Free Soil Party does not win a victory, but as we see from this, the Democrat, who you would think might get the vote, ends up losing to a Whig who's a Southern planter, which is an interesting mix. And so in the end, it's the Whig, who should be a Northern candidate from our eyes today, but who's a Southern planter, who ends up getting the presidency. And this is an interesting moment, because in some ways the Whigs wouldn't have wanted a Southern planter, but if it gets them the votes to get the presidency, then they're more than willing to go along with it. And so in the electoral vote, as you can see at the top, Whig gets the majority, And he does get most of the vote. This is just an election propaganda picture for the Free Soil Party. And they didn't win, as we saw here, but they did get 10% of the vote, but no electoral votes. After 1848, we see a very important moment for this process of disunion. Because, as mentioned, there are some political groups who no longer want to allow the compromise of liberty and slavery to continue on both sides. But instead, what happens during these 2 years since the 1848 election is a very important compromise does emerge instead. It is intended by the architects of this compromise to continue the coexistence of liberty and slavery. But, as you will see in the end, that's not what ends up happening because something else is going on in the United States of America. So the 1850 Compromise proposes the following. And again, if you think currently the United States Senate and Congress and presidency, no matter who is in it 3 years ago or today, have a lot of political conflict, this would be similar if they had found to create some sort of compromise. In the Senate, Clay offers a compromise on one hand to make the anti-slavery groups happy. He says, sure, California will enter the Union as a free state without any slave states as a balance, and thus the Senate will now have more free states than slave states votes. 2, the slave trade, which is occurring in the United States capital, Washington, D.C., it will no longer be permitted, and this is supposed to make anti-slavery folk satisfied. On the same hand, it says, in those new territories added by the victory over Mexico in the war, slave status will be based on popular sovereignty. This is a change because in the Missouri Compromise, which we didn't learn in this class, there was a line drawn, and north of that line, slavery would not be permitted, and south of that line, it would be. But this now opens it up, so it's not resolved. And it's possible, from a pro-slavery point of view, that slavery could be permitted now north of the line that had been agreed upon. And then the fourth, like the third, is also seen as a more pro-slavery point of view. In the 1850 Compromise, in response to California entering as a free state and the slave trade ending, there would be a new fugitive slave law. Remember, there was a fugitive slave law in the Constitution of 1787, but this new one would be more aggressive and permit the recapturing of freed slaves in the North as Southern property. So you have the group that wants to maintain the compromise, like the senators of Clay and Douglas and many others, who say, instead of the United States fracturing into sections, this 1850 compromise is the best choice, because although, you or whatever your particular position is on how much slavery there should or shouldn't be in the United States, this keeps us all together. Now, as hinted at in the South, as represented by Calhoun from South Carolina, there is a faction that says we don't even need this compromise because slavery is protected and has been since 1787. And if we don't continue that, well, there's no union. We'll break apart. Screw you. Likewise, as I'll explain in class, in person with the Free Soil, Free Labor movement, an anti-compromise position has been brewing, which says, That thing we did with allowing slavery in the Constitution of 1787, well, we're not doing that anymore. And we're not going to compromise. So you have the compromise in the middle, and then you have two positions of no compromise that are either pro-slavery or anti-slavery. Well, due to situations beyond their control, there is a new president, President Fillmore, and he helps negotiate through Congress the compromise. And so the compromise position wins instead of the no compromise position, either pro-North or pro-South. So when we look at the map from the Compromise of 1850, I want you to look at Texas is kind of near the bottom there, if you see that, and then the Indian Territory, and then a line above the Indian Territory. That was the line from the Missouri Compromise, which slavery would not be permitted above or north of that line. But the compromise does open up that territory to popular sovereignty. So if you're an American who's worried about the expansion of slavery, which I'm going to go over on Wednesday, then the compromise has lifted the marker, the place on the map which slavery can continue. And if you are in a no compromise position from pro-Southern point of view, you're worried that the addition of California and the actions of your northern neighbors who want to end slavery are in fact a problem. But we'll see. We'll see. There's a compromise in 1850. We'll see if it continues. Here is a political cartoon which says that the Fugitive Slave Act of the Compromise of 1850 was secretly added and tricked the North in the Compromise of 1850. And here is another pro-abolition political cartoon, which is against the fugitive slave law. And here is one more. Again, these are not the pro-compromise group, but the anti-compromise group from the position of anti-slavery. So remember when we kind of started this back in the first Congress with the introduction of abolition bills and how the North responded with a silence to the arguments of the pro-slavery group, like, so can you pay us for our property? I didn't think so. And what, do you want black folk to live among you? There seems to be, so far in this portion of the chapter, a movement against that, saying, yeah, we do want slavery to end. I don't have an answer for your questions to me, but I do know that morally I want slavery to end. And that's what's starting to build by the 1850s. And interestingly enough, this is driven by the fact that potentially there could be an expansion of slavery, and the group that doesn't want to compromise anymore is worried about this. Frederick Douglass represents an important American who represents this position that the compromise between slavery and liberty can't continue anymore. It's something that the United States can't do. So we'll keep our eye on him. He in the 1840s and 50s represents what used to be a fairly tiny portion of the northern political position, that a compromise was no longer possible. Remember, we had a very slim number of white Northerners who agreed with him, and then the vast majority of African Americans agreed with him, but they didn't have a lot of power prior to the 1850s. We see the growth of pro-abolitionist positions, such as the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by an abolitionist. And this became a big cultural marker in the North, that slavery in the South was a problem that was so big it needed to be dealt with. Okay. So we get to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which also occurs in the 1850s. And because Frederick Douglass and some others wanted to extend the railroad towards the west, we see that the Kansas-Nebraska Act was developed. And what's kind of interesting is that two abolitionists were involved in this. And they wanted to create two new states, and it's in your text on a map called the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And in it, you can see a Kansas territory and Nebraska territory, and they're trying to add these as states, but they're trying to do so in a way which won't harm, the unity or the prosperity of the United States. They're trying not to tear it apart. And so Frederick Douglass, as a major politician, proposes that Kansas and Nebraska should be added to the Union, and that, like the 1850 compromise said, whether they allow slavery or not can be determined by popular sovereignty. We'll just let the people decide. But its result was that there was beginning of the disillusion and problems for the parties. So on one hand, what I'm going to discuss on Wednesday, the free soil groups who no longer want compromise, they're going to begin to collect money and send immigrants to Kansas. Now, both the groups who didn't want compromise felt that Nebraska would come in as a free state, but they felt Kansas might be a slave state or a free state, and that's where they were going to do their activity. It's kind of like today in 2021, if you were preparing for the next election, or especially the presidential election, if you could send about 10, 20, or 50,000 immigrants to those states where the voting for, the Republican or Democratic candidate had only been decided by thousands of votes or 10,000s of votes, and you were going to, throw or determine the presidential election by sending immigrants there, right? So in the United States in 2021, the popular vote for the past, 8 votes have been overwhelmingly on one side. I don't care what it is. I'm just looking at it, strategically from a historian's point of view. But the Electoral College has been determined one way or another based on tens of thousands of votes in certain states, which have been close, right? Since 1992, if you go look it up, one party has beaten the other party for president 7 out of 8 times. But because the Electoral College doesn't represent that, it represents states voting. 1,000 or 10,000 votes here or there can make a difference. And this is the same or similar process which occurs when the Kansas-Nebraska Act is bringing in 2 states. And so both those who want to stop slavery and those who want to extend slavery are sending immigrants into Kansas. And the result is a chaotic one, where neither side will recognize the election or process of the other side. So what happens in democracy, if you don't have a single institution and group that's determining what elections are or are not, and you have 2 parties who are saying opposite things about whether an election occurs or not, then you have a breakdown of the system. And that's exactly what happens in Kansas in the 1850s. So when you look at the reading, what you'll see is that both groups are refusing to accept what the elections are. And once you have enough of the population not willing to agree upon the rules of what happened during the election, then democracy breaks apart. And that's what happens in Kansas, right? And it gets so big as you'll read that even in Congress, you'll have, instead of discussion and boring talk, you even have violence on the floor of Congress. So, the next two illustrations just show you that there is a disagreement upon what's happening in Kansas. In this one, it shows Liberty there in the middle, the woman with her Liberty cap, trying or pleading to get justice done in a democratic way, but that the party that goes against her, that wants to get its own party's power rather than comply with the rules of democracy, that they're not going to listen to her. So that's what Bleeding Kansas or Bloody Kansas is all about, is a breakdown of institutional role, especially for voting. Right? I know that was really fast. So here is the cartoon trying to show that the pro-slavery person is out of line and uses violence to get what he wants. So we're going to come back to this slide here, which again is very important about where the Republican Party comes from. But what I want to do, sorry, I went too fast because it showed too many.
So I'm going to interrupt this presentation and cover this slide for you. Whoops, till we accidentally go back too far. So perhaps one of the most interesting developments in the 1850s that most Americans wouldn't know about because they don't take this course is that something happened and created a semi-powerful, it's powerful, but it's not overwhelming, a political movement that becomes the Republican Party. Now, don't take this too far. Some people today will say, hey, the Republican Party today is the Republican Party of then, and the Democratic Party of then is No, they're not the same. They're not the same animals since 1850s till now. Going back to the 1850s, though, what's very interesting is that a group of disparate Americans joined together under a party for different reasons. And looking at the top three, what you'll notice is that outside of the slavery economy, a new market economy, which you studied in a different chapter, has developed. And that group, especially the industrialists who own the means of production, they are opposed to slavery for economic reasons. So keep that in mind. It's not a slavery, it's not a moral thing. It's not a statement that all races are equal and therefore I don't want slavery. It's an anti-slavery movement that begins to emerge in the Republican Party. So again, going to bullet point 3, the industrialists want rural consumers. Slaves are not rural consumers. So industrialists see slavery as a system that will make their goals more difficult. Bullet point number 4, rural farmers with urban consumers. We have a variety of farms in the north who seek to sell their goods to urban consumers, and they see slavery as getting in the way of that. They won't be their consumers. Bullet point number 5. Immigration from Europe is skyrocketing during this period, which leads to bullet point number 6, to anti-immigrant arguments. Now, you may be familiar with anti-immigrant arguments today in 2024, whether you oppose or support them. It's not material to this class, but you recognize them. These are arguments that are being made in the 1850s by the American or Know Nothing Party. So, this idea that immigrants represent some culture that is antithetical to the United States and is going to ruin the United States is certainly nothing new. So, if it's 2024 and you're hearing these arguments, again, recognize that this is over 170 years old at least, and it doesn't make it right or wrong. It's nothing new in this case. And so by 1856, we see an interesting coalition of groups that are different or not all the same. Northern Whigs, Democrats who are anti-slavery, remember, not compromise. Compromise had been the major group in the North and the South until the 1850s, and that is starting to lose its position. Free Soilers and Know Nothings are coming together to be this group, and that's the interesting shift. Is free soil, free labor? What it argues, and a lot of these groups join it, is that the United States of America is built on the idea that you as an individual, and they usually use the word men, should be free to work your own land or free to work where you want. Free soil, free labor. And that's the system that was best for the United States. However, again, key moment, free soil, free labor argued that slavery and the slave owners got in the way of that. They have gotten around the political and economic systems of the United States, and in engaging in slavery have increased their political control of the United States, which they rightfully notice that the vast majority of American presidents have been from the slave-owning population, large slave owners, and the Supreme Court as well. And they're arguing, again, against slavery, not because they think of racial equality, but that slavery, the system, is getting in the way of the freedom of northern white people. So I hope you can kind of hear what's going on with that as we rejoin the previous lecture. I just inserted this myself.
Is that the Know Nothings are a small part of the rise of something no one saw, of a party who will eventually end up becoming very anti-slavery. That is the Know Nothings. So there was in the United States, among the powerful white population, especially in the North, a hostility to immigrants. In this case, they identified Catholics, so white Catholics, as a problem. They said, we are America. America has a certain way of being, but these immigrants, they threaten our way of life. If there's so many immigrants who don't think the way we do, then our way of life is threatened. Which is kind of interesting to me as a historian, because if your way of life was so, convincing and powerful, why would a minority of immigrants threaten that? But, they're not here to answer my question. So here's an example of the Know Nothing Party and the flags they would make. It says Native Americans, and they're not talking about indigenous communities. They're talking about white Northerners, in this case in the North. Beware of foreign influence. Here is an example of some of the clothing or decorative clothing that they would wear. And so they felt that Irish Catholics represented a threat to the United States of America. So they called it the Know Nothing Party, and it wanted to keep power for native-born Americans, and it wanted to resist the aggressions of the Catholic Church, because they thought that foreigners wanted to change America as it was currently represented. So, all right. So they wanted to keep America the way it was and not allow immigrants to change it into something else. So as we approach the 1856 election, and this is the same time that the Kansas problem is occurring, we have our first candidate, which is a Republican, which I'm going to again go over on Wednesday. And this candidate, who is a Republican, gets about 33% of the popular vote and about 38% of the electoral vote. But as you can see, the Democratic candidate, who, on one hand, represents a maintenance of the compromise between liberty and slavery, which the southern states, as you can see by this map, see as a continuation of allowing slavery where it is and maybe expanding it. The Democratic candidate wins the Electoral College by a significant margin. So the Know-Nothings, the Republicans, and the Democrats are at issue for the 1856 election. Only 4 years later now, right? The next presidential election. And it is the combination, listen carefully, it's the combination of the compromise position in the North, let slavery and liberty coexist, and the more radical let slavery expand position in the South that combine to create a 45% popular vote, but a majority in the Electoral College. And so for now, again, we're only 4 years before Lincoln gets elected. For now, there is definitely a problem in the United States and an inability to agree on generally what should be going on in regards to slavery. But the compromise and the pro-slavery position has held firm, and the anti-slavery or abolitionist position has not. But we only have 4 years to go to the Civil War, as a reminder. And what we're going to look to, not on Wednesday, but on Friday, we're going to go into very minute detail in the 1858 Douglas-Lincoln debates.
You can ignore the following statements until I say otherwise.
On how that starts to finally change. And by this is the 1858 picture, but by 1860, the Union of the United States of America, which started in 1787, specifically with the Constitution, finally falls apart. We're going to find out the details of how that eventually stopped.
Okay, and as we rejoin, we're going to see this last section. So I hope you can see it's kind of an interesting development. It's complicated and not easy, and a lot of people ignore it, is that, do you like the United States and its political stability? Do you like that the economy is stable today in 2024? Well, if so, you're kind of in the group in the 1850s that said, hey, we want to have liberty. Okay, again, I know ideologically we're in a different spot, but systematically, that the system is working. Let's not ruin it. And then on either side, in 1850s, you have a group who says, no, the current system is wrong. We need to eliminate slavery for various reasons, again. Some of them are abolitionists who believe in racial equality. A lot are not, but they think slavery should be gone. And then you have another group that said slavery should grow and be expanded. So you have kind of these three groups. And as we approach the 1860 election, we're going to see what's happening. So in 1857, the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court, which again was dominated by pro-slavery justices, said many things, but of those things, one, slaves are not citizens, and so they can't sue in court. And here's the big thing: the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Congress cannot ban slavery. So what they've done in the Dred Scott decision, just think about it very carefully. I know some of you are already falling asleep. Wake up! Okay, now you're woken up. Here we go. If a slave is in Illinois, and a slave is still a slave in Illinois, then isn't slavery everywhere? And that's the position that those who wanted to end slavery were taking. And they're not wrong. If slavery is not legal in Illinois, but a slave can be in Illinois and still be a slave, where are the limits, right? And so you'll see an increase in activism against slavery. So in 1858, what you'll find in this class in the summer is that there is Douglas who wants to keep the compromise going, but Lincoln in Illinois says we've got to stop the compromise. We have to draw the line. Now he will be race baited by Douglas and called a lover of African Americans, and there'll be all sorts of statements in the Freeport Doctrine, which you're not reading for this class, which Douglas is, positioning himself towards the white voters that Lincoln is a problem because he believes in too much racial equality, including interracial marriage and sex, which Lincoln will deny in 1859. Says, no, that's not good. I don't believe in that. That's the most common position of white Northerners, that those things are bad. So Lincoln isn't out of step with that. But what you do see is that the Lincoln position in 58 is saying, hey, but slavery itself, we got to end. And then between 58 and 60, he's finding some nooks and crannies how to figure this out. He says, yes, African Americans are inferior. Lincoln is saying this. But they do have the right to be our equal. Right? It's that one of the most interesting political statements of speaking out of both sides of your mouth. And you'll notice that if you listen to politicians struggling with difficult questions, they will tend to do that. They'll say both positions somehow. So in this class, we're not looking at the documents, so we're just going to move on and say that was going on in 58, and Lincoln does not win, as you will remember. But in 1859, the more aggressive anti-slavery group, the abolitionists, including John Brown, he decides to, hey, let's go ahead and have an armed rebellion, and let's carry out this ending of slavery. He did not win his rebellion, and he was executed. But again, both sides screaming at the court decision, there was a plot against us. And the other side saying, no, he's a hero. And ironically, John Brown says, this is never going to end without a lot of blood. So here's a pro-John Brown painting later, kissing African-American babies on his way to the gallows. I don't know, this is one on the way to the gallows. So 1860, in case it's not clear and most people don't really think about it, in 1860, the United States of America political system broke. The United States, as has been since the Constitution, ended. And in that run-up to the 1860 election, you'll see increasingly the South is arguing that the Union means we'll become slaves to the North. And so the fire eaters are the group that say we need to allow slavery everywhere. If we don't do that, then we will lose our liberty. Again, kind of interesting, an ironic position. If we can't enslave people everywhere in the United States, we'll lose our liberty. So you have the election coming up, and in the Democratic convention, Douglas, who is a compromise, saying, again, let's just keep this going. We can have slavery and liberty, no problem. He wins, but the group that loses, the fire eaters, say, oh, screw that. that doesn't count because our position didn't get carried forward, right? And you think about that, right? There's rules to party primaries, there's rules to electoral college constitution elections. And if a major portion of the United States just say, oh, screw that after the effect, I lost, therefore it doesn't matter, then that can really harm the ability of the democracy to function, right? Because if you're challenging that the systems are actually functioning, then you're inserting yourself or what you say happened as reality. And that's what the fire eaters do. Then they have their own Democratic convention for Breckenridge. The Republican groups really gather on this new Lincoln under the free soil, free labor ideology. Again, whether they're rural farmers or industrialists or abolitionists or anti immigrant know nothings, they're all going to rally around that because the Republican Party says these following issues. You could check them out in the text. And so one political cartoonist noticed that the United States is being torn apart, and this is before the Civil War. Now you notice there's a fourth candidate, Lincoln on the left, Stephen Douglas in the middle. What the fourth candidate is a Southern position which wants to compromise between the compromise, Frederick Douglass, and the Fire Eaters candidate, and they call it Constitutional Union. His name is Bell. So we have a very interesting election, right? Where, look at the top. I mean the bottom. If we count the popular vote, it's all over the map. Lincoln gets the majority of the plurality of the popular vote compared to the others. It's really hard to say whether those three other parties outvoted Lincoln or not, right? Because they are not in a total agreement. But looking at the North, the electoral vote, which counts majorities, right? It doesn't count each person's vote. It counts the person's vote in a particular state where the majority or the largest percentage of that vote gets all the votes. Then the Electoral College goes to Lincoln. And so we have a case which is interesting in that Lincoln gets 59% of the electoral vote and thus the presidency, according to the Constitution, no question. But 4 out of 10 people voted for him, and 6 out of 10 voted for a non-Republican candidate. And so those Southern Democrat Breckenridge states, you can see the green ones, once they know the results of the election, they say, okay, United States is over, we're done, we're moving out. While those yellowy states, they wanted to keep the compromise going, and they're not so sure. And so looking at this, just want to remind you, look at Kentucky, who followed the compromise candidate, and look at Missouri, who followed a compromise candidate. They don't secede from the Union. And that's one of the biggest, not the biggest, but one element of secession and the Confederacy a lot of people don't know. Not all slave states seceded from the Union. Missouri, Kentucky, part of Virginia, we're going to call West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, they are not part of the Confederacy. So there are slave states in the North during the Civil War. You'll want to keep your eye on that. So, of the 4 candidates, Lincoln wins the Electoral College. There's not a question about that. He doesn't win a majority of the votes, not a question about that. And then a variety of the Deep South states secede long before he can take the presidency. And then Tennessee and 2/3 of Virginia, geographically, join them. So that leads us to April 1861, when in the South, a Southern Army force attacks a United States Army force at Fort Sumter. And we have the beginning of the Civil War.